Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sandy McKenzie, chair of the DEI Committee here at Washington REALTORS, and I'm so excited to be joined by Adria Buchanan, executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Washington. Welcome, Adria.
Thank you.
April is Fair Housing Month, and we wanted to take some time to talk about what that really means and why it matters just as much today as it did when the Fair Housing Act was signed into law back in 1968. So to start us off, can you share what Fair Housing Month is all about and why it's important that we take the time to recognize it?
For sure, and thank you for having me. So in 1968, in April, President Lyndon B. Johnson, he signed the Civil Rights Act, and part of that included the Fair Housing Act. And so April is when we recognize how important it is to make sure that people are not being discriminated against in housing, whether it's the sale, the rental, or the financing of that housing.
And what are some of the biggest challenges that people are facing now when it comes to fair housing?
So I think one of the biggest challenges right now, as I'm sure many of you know, is affordability. So not only when it comes to buying a home, but also in renting a home, people are trying to figure out how do they ensure that that home is not taking up so much of their income that they bring in every month. So affordability is really the primary factor when people are looking for housing. And so making sure that people can get into those homes and afford those homes is really important. We see that in financing. So when they're going to apply for a loan, there are programs all across the board, which I'll get into a little bit later. But in terms of financing, that really is where we see a lot of discrimination, not only in the loan applications, but also when they're looking for insurance, other types of components to being able to afford that home and maintain it. So algorithmic bias is really something that we see a lot when people are applying for rental housing. There are all of these ways that we see discrimination take place, and it happens a lot of times behind the curtain. So it's not when they go into the leasing office or when they go to talk to the loan officer, but it's in all those things that happen that they're not aware of. And
Right.
When they get that final decision and it says, oh, sorry, you don't qualify, that's when our work begins. And we're trying to figure out, well, really what was impacting that person's experience. And oftentimes it's because of a protected class.
Just to kind of take that just a little bit further, what can your office do in terms of assisting folks when they are faced with that kind of discrimination?
I appreciate the question. So our agency, we serve all of Western Washington. So we serve 23 counties, and we focus on 4 main areas. So the first is advocacy. We do a lot of work with policymakers and folks like you all to really advocate for initiatives that further housing opportunity. The second thing that we do is we investigate allegations of discrimination. So folks across our service area will contact us with their experience. So sometimes it has to do more with landlord-tenant issues. Other times it's them saying, hey, I went to go look for a home. I'm working with a realtor and this was my experience. And we help them drill down into what those differences are that they experienced. And then sometimes that means that we have to do testing. And so then that's the third part of what we do is we send out secret shoppers. They could be posing as renters or home buyers. And we document what their experience is like trying to obtain housing. If we notice that there are differences, and if we can look at the data and see maybe there's some disparate impact issue, then we'll gather all of that evidence and we'll file a complaint with one of our enforcement agencies. And then the fourth thing that we do is a lot of what you all do as well is training. So we train our property management folks, we train realtors and housing authorities, different policymakers, and other stakeholders in the housing arena. So that's how we really get involved. But in terms of working directly with clients, we really help them think about their situation without trying to lead them to any one conclusion. We help them think about what they experienced, and if they feel like it was because of some aspect of their identity, then we help them figure out how to document that and how to take that to an enforcement agency for investigation.
So from your perspective, how do diversity, equity, and inclusion connect with housing? It feels like those values show up in every part of where we live and how people live.
So diversity, equity, and inclusion are really important when we think about neighborhoods more broadly, making sure that we're having inclusionary zoning, that we are facilitating opportunities for people to thrive. And so I think for municipalities, it's really important to think about how they're siting new development, how they're maintaining existing properties. That really is going to impact not only property value, but how people live and how they move and how they feel about the place that they live. When it comes to organizations and how housing providers show up, I think it's really important for housing providers to think about their staffing And so do their leasing agents reflect the communities that they serve? Do the people that are making policies about people's applications, about whether they're going to be approved or denied, whether their maintenance is going to get done or not, do those individuals reflect the communities that they're serving? When we have more perspectives, we have more people that can help mitigate risk for the organization. And so I think when we think about housing, we need to think about mitigating risk. That's really important for landlords. It's really important for people who are renting out their home. It's really important for realtors. And so the more folks that you have at the table that can help you think through different perspectives, the more likely you're going to be able to assess all the different situations that can come up in an organization and how to respond. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, I think is something, it's this hot topic and acronym that people want to throw around, but at the end of the day, it really is a risk mitigation tool.
So I know your team works directly with individuals and communities. Is there a moment or story that stands out to you where your work really made a difference?
Yes. So it's hard to talk about just one story because we serve so many people. We serve 23 counties all across Western and Central Washington. And I would say the majority of the clients that we serve are individuals with disabilities. And that is really consistent across the nation. Over half of the fair housing complaints that come in every year are on the basis of disability. And so a lot of times what we're doing is we're helping folks with reasonable accommodations and modifications, particularly in rental housing. So we have folks who maybe they have an assistance animal that's not getting approved. And so we work with their landlord to figure out, okay, what is the landlord concerned about and what are the symptoms that the tenant is trying to mitigate, and how can we come together to create a resolution that works for everybody. On the home buying side, sometimes our experiences with HOAs, so homeowners associations, I'm sure many realtors out there have had their run-ins with HOAs, and some of them are very good. Others, not so much. And so sometimes we are working with HOA board presidents and members to understand, so that they understand what their housing rights are and what their responsibilities are. We've had individuals in the past who maybe needed a generator because they were on life support, or they had a pacemaker, or some medical condition that required 24/7 access to electricity. And so they needed a generator put in. And the HOA, in addition to neighbors left and right, weren't big fans of having the generator because it produced some noise. Do you want noise or do you want to live, right? So these are the things that we're trying to get people to understand. And so we were able to come up with a solution for that tenant so that they could maintain their livelihood, right? And we see this also with families who have children who are autistic. Sometimes HOAs have a lot of restrictions as far as how a home can look, including window treatments, right? And so we had a situation where there was a family that had a child who was autistic, and the window treatments needed to be a certain way because the way that the light came in exacerbated the symptoms of the child's disability. And so we had a lot of back and forth with the the homeowners association, and were able to come up with an alternative that met the needs of the child, but also, again, met kind of the community standards and design standards of the HOA. So we experience lots of different things. Our clients experience lots of different things. And so we are really experts at figuring out how to negotiate between lots of different options and make sure that at the end of the day, everybody's happy.
Yeah, it's interesting that half of your complaints are based on disability. And that's kind of something that we've talked about as an organization that we don't spend enough time on. So maybe we need to find ways, to reach out to members of the community to find out, what are those needs that aren't being met, and how can we help with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think particularly in the home buying sense, there are challenges that individuals with disabilities face that we are still trying to figure out. We had a client, for example, who was looking to buy a home, and she had some mobility impairments, and so she was in a wheelchair, and she was very scared to purchase a home because she wasn't sure that she was going to be able to modify it after the purchase. Mm-hmm. And the loan type that she was using, I believe it was FHA, gave her some room to seek out contractors to do that work before she purchased the home. But again, it's really operating in good faith that those contractors are going to come through and modify the home in the way that's going to make it accessible for her. So just that story alone, I think, gives realtors some insight into what challenges people with disabilities are facing. And, you're making a huge purchase. And so if you can't even get through the front door, how do you justify making that purchase? Right. So we definitely need more accessible homes on the market and ways to be able to guarantee that someone who's buying a home is going to have the modifications that they need.
Yeah, one more tool for us to put in our toolbox.
For sure.
Yeah. So sometimes people think discrimination in housing is a thing of the past, which we know that it is not. And so what are some of the common misconceptions that you run into, and what would you say to people who think that doesn't happen anymore?
Well, discrimination is still very real. And the way that we see it show up a lot of times now is behind the curtain. So behind the screen in algorithmic bias. For example, a renter may fill out an application and they go to put in their income and there's no place for them to put in alternative sources of income. So whether they're getting child support or marital support, or if they're getting SSI, there's no place for them to put that in. And so then they're not able to move to the next screen to complete their application. Other times we see it in terms of assistance animals. So if someone is using an assistance animal, emotional support animal, service animal, the property management company will oftentimes require that they go through a third-party screening. So petscreening.com or another service like that. And those services will assess their situation, make them fill out a bunch of documents, and then feed that information to the property management company to complete their application. The challenge is that a lot of times people who are disabled and who need emotional support animals, they don't necessarily know that right when they're applying. They may just be looking for a property at first, and then once they get into the property, they figure out what they need, and then they'll make the request for the emotional support animal. In that situation, the challenge is that the property management company can say, oh, well, you lied on your application because you didn't disclose this up front, or we asked you and you said no, and now you're coming back and asking for this. So we see that a lot. The other thing that happens is kind of this just invisible denial of housing. And that happens when people are not called back. So they may inquire about a particular property, and then the property management company, the leasing agent, whoever it is that's on the other side, they just don't return the call. If the person is asking for a reasonable accommodation, they say, oh, let me check with so-and-so. And then again, that call is never returned. So we see that a lot of times as well.
And we deal mainly with home buyers. And so just curious, do you get complaints as far as, with home buyers, and are you seeing that kind of discrimination in the home buying process?
Yeah, we see that too. So we had one client recently, she was mobility challenged, and so she was in a wheelchair and she was looking for housing. She was in a very precarious situation because she wanted to buy a home, but she was really unsure as to whether or not she was going to be able to modify that home for her condition. And so she's making this huge purchase and not knowing if she's physically even going to be able to enter through the front door. And so I think that's a challenge for realtors and the home buying community, is to figure out, how do we guarantee people are going to have access to their house, literally, once they make that purchase, especially if they're using an FHA loan or some other loan type that's requiring that they get bids for that work prior to making the purchase.
And just to take just one step further, I'm just kind of curious, what do you think the rate of non-reporting is as far as discrimination cases are concerned? How many people do you think aren't, or just, they're just, walking away and saying, okay, whatever, and not reporting what's happening to them?
I think the number is really high. And I think especially now, because affordability is such an issue. Right. And so people are more concerned about, can I even afford to live here? And if they can, or just barely, they don't want to raise any other issues. And so we see that, we saw this a lot during COVID, where people were really more concerned about just being able to stay in their home than actually enjoy it. Right. So I think definitely there's a lot of underreporting.
So as an organization, we're always looking for ways to support equity and inclusion beyond just talking about it. What are some ways that businesses, real estate professionals, or even just individuals can take action to support fair housing?
I love that question. I think there are many ways that people can support fair housing and help to create more inclusive communities. And I think that can start at the individual level, really recognizing just what your personal privilege is and using that in service to others. So if you are someone who has the ability to move about as you please, how can you use your privilege to help those who are mobility challenged, right? If you encounter someone who has intellectual disabilities, how can you be of better service to them? If you come across somebody who has children and you see them struggling, what are ways that you can help them just on an individual level? I think people are really receptive and really welcoming of that individual personalized help, just recognizing, hey, there's something that I can do, whether it's open the door or, give you a couple of extra days to review this application. Those are things that people really appreciate, having that grace. And then I think from an organizational perspective, it's really figuring out what training are you providing to your staff? How are you helping them to be more aware, not of just what their own privilege is, but also what their responsibilities are as agents of the organization, right? They are representatives of you and the work that you're doing. And so how do you ensure that they are not only aware of what could be challenges to serving their clients, but what are the opportunities that they're not seeing? So definitely having training, having just even training within departments, all of those ways that we can connect on an interpersonal level with each other. Because if I can recall, some story that you shared with me, then when I go out and I'm speaking with people, I can remember, oh yeah, Sandy said this, So the more that we know about each other, the more that we can be integrated into each other's lives and to not just be so narrowly focused on the things that we're doing. I think that can help us to create more inclusive communities.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you because I remember I did an online training once and it had to do with disabilities. And it was, just some of the things that were being discussed, I was like, I never would have thought that would be an issue. And it's not until you hear it that things start to click and you go, I can see where that would be a problem and something we need to pay more attention to.
For sure. And that just comes from sharing stories and knowing who you're working with and who your clients are.
Right. And so what gives you hope in this work? Are there changes that you're seeing that point to progress?
I am excited about what is ahead because I think there are a lot of innovative programs that are coming out, particularly around home buying. And so, even locally, there's a program called Frolic, and they're helping to create more affordable housing. And there are programs like Homium and these shared equity models. And so I think the future is really bright in terms of housing finance and making housing more affordable for people and recognizing that we need to create more access and people need to be able to tap into their equity. If they are a homeowner, they need to be able to tap into that equity without going broke, and we need to have better relationships with our financial institutions, I think, and really encouraging them to put out products that are accessible to more people. And so I just encourage realtors in particular, realtors do a lot of work with lenders, but to push them to think about how can we make these products more accessible? How can we ensure that people can afford, that they can afford the loan, but that we're not creating unnecessary barriers to them being able to do that.
So just to wrap up, if you had a magic wand and could change one thing about the housing system right now, what would it be?
Give everyone a house.
Yeah.
Just give everyone a house.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think we'd all agree with that. That would be fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Adria, for being here and for sharing your insights with us. If you're watching and want to learn more or get involved, check out the Fair Housing Center of Washington's website and Washington Realtors Fair Housing Resources website. Links to both will be in the description. You can also find a link to the Washington Realtors DEI website in the description as well. And of course, let's all keep working to create communities where everyone has a fair and equal place to call home. Thanks for joining us and being a Washington Realtors member, and happy Fair Housing Month.